The Arctic has always been a place where silence screams. In 1923, a six-man expedition ventured into the uncharted territories of the northern Greenland ice sheet, seeking glory, discovery, and perhaps answers to questions no one had yet dared to ask. They carried provisions for 3 months, sled dogs trained for the harshest conditions, and instruments meant to map the unknown. But what they encountered was not listed in any scientific journal or explorer's manual. It was something that defied logic, something that moved in the blizzard like a phantom made of ice and shadow. The few who returned spoke in whispers, their eyes haunted by memories that wouldn't fade. They claimed they were chased, hunted, by something that should not exist. They called it the Ice Yeti. The year 1923 was a time of fervent exploration. The world was still reeling from the Great War, and humanity sought escape in the romance of discovery. The Arctic, that vast white void at the top of the world, beckoned to those brave, or foolish, enough to answer. Among them was Captain Henrik Voss, a Norwegian explorer with a reputation for pushing beyond safe boundaries. Alongside him were 5 men, 2 scientists, a cartographer, a photographer, and a seasoned guide named Bjorn Anderson, a man who had spent more years in the frozen north than most men spent alive. They departed from a remote settlement on the western coast of Greenland in late February, when the sun barely crept above the horizon and the landscape was locked in perpetual twilight. Their goal was ambitious: to map a region of the interior ice sheet that had never been charted, to collect meteorological data, and to investigate rumors, whispers from local Inuit communities, of strange phenomena occurring deep within the ice fields. The locals spoke of Kaljupillik, of spirits that live beneath the ice, but Captain Voss dismissed these as folklore. He was a man of science, after all. The first 2 weeks were uneventful, though brutally cold. Temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The men traveled in shifts, their sled dogs pulling heavy loads across endless expanses of white. At night, they huddled in canvas tents that shuddered against the wind, the cold so intense it burned their lungs with every breath. Yet morale remained high. They were making history, or so they believed. It was on the 15th day that the first signs appeared. The cartographer, a meticulous Swede named Lars Ekman, noticed something unusual while sketching the terrain. Footprints, large, impossibly large, pressed deep into the snow. They were vaguely humanoid but distorted, as if whatever made them walk with a gait no human could replicate. Each print measured nearly 2 feet in length, with 5 distinct toe marks that ended in what appeared to be claw indentations. Bjorn examined them closely, his weathered face unreadable. "Not bear," he muttered. "Not wolf. Not caribou." He knelt, running a gloved hand along the edge of one print. Too deliberate, too shaped. Could it be another expedition? One of the scientists, Dr. Emil Hartmann, suggested. "No," Bjorn replied flatly. "No man leaves tracks like this." Captain Voss dismissed concern. Perhaps it was a geological anomaly, a trick of the ice. They pressed on. But that night, as the men settled into their tents, the dogs began to howl. Not the usual restless barking, but a deep, guttural sound filled with terror. The animals strained against their tethers, eyes wide and white-rimmed, staring into the darkness beyond the camp's perimeter. "Something's out there," Bjorn whispered. The men emerged from their tents, rifles in hand, scanning the surrounding ice. The wind had picked up, and snow swirled in chaotic spirals, reducing visibility to mere feet. And then they heard it, a sound that made their blood freeze colder than the air around them. A howl, low, resonant, and utterly inhuman. It echoed across the frozen expanse, bouncing off unseen ice walls, impossible to pinpoint. What in God's name was that? Dr. Hartmann stammered. No one answered. They stood in silence, breath steaming in the frigid air, waiting. The howl came again, closer this time, joined by another and then another. It was as if the ice itself was screaming. Captain Voss ordered the men back into the tents, weapons ready. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every creak of the ice, every gust of wind, sounded like footsteps approaching. The dogs whimpered and refused to lie down, their instincts screaming warnings their masters could not fully comprehend. When dawn finally broke, a dim, gray light that barely qualified as morning, The men emerged to find their camp surrounded by tracks, dozens of them, circling the tents in a deliberate, methodical pattern. Whatever had made them had stood mere feet from where the men slept, watching, waiting. Lars counted the prints, his hands trembling. There were at least 6 of them, he said quietly. Maybe more. 6 of what? Dr. Hartmann demanded. No one had an answer. Captain Voss made a decision. They would not turn back. Retreat would mean failure, and failure was not an option, but they would proceed with caution. The men armed themselves, kept the dogs close, and moved only during daylight hours. Yet the presence, whatever it was, did not leave them. Each night, the howls returned. Each morning, new tracks appeared. On the 21st day, the photographer, a young Dane named Thomas Mahler, managed to capture something on film. He had set up his camera at dusk, hoping to photograph the aurora borealis if it appeared. Instead, he captured a silhouette, a massive, hulking figure standing at the edge of the camp, barely visible through the blowing snow. It was upright, bipedal, towering at least 8 feet tall. Its arms hung low, almost to its knees, and its head was large, featureless in the grainy image. When Thomas showed the photograph to the others, the tent fell silent. "What is that?" someone whispered. Bjorn stared at the image, his jaw tight. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I've heard stories. Old stories. From the Inuit elders. They speak of something that lives in the deepest ice. Something that was here long before us." "Superstition," Captain Voss snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. That night, the howls were deafening. The dogs broke free from their tethers and fled into the darkness, never to be seen again. The men were alone now, stranded in the frozen wilderness, stalked by something that defied explanation. And deep down, each of them knew they were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. The concept of a creature lurking in the Arctic ice is not new. Long before Henrik Voss and his men set foot on that desolate expanse, indigenous peoples of the circumpolar regions spoke of beings that dwelled in the frozen wastes. The Inuit called them by many names. Kalyapilik, Mahaha, Irok, spirits and monsters that inhabited the liminal spaces between the human world and the unknown. These were not mere campfire tales meant to frighten children. They were warnings. In the oral traditions of the Greenlandic Inuit, there exists a particularly chilling story about the Tornet, a race of giant, primitive beings who once lived alongside humans in the far north. According to legend, the Tornet were immensely strong but slow-witted, capable of incredible feats of endurance, but possessing a savage, unpredictable nature. They were said to be taller than any man, covered in thick, shaggy fur, and able to survive in conditions that would kill a human in minutes. The Tornet were eventually driven away or died out, but some elders insisted that remnant of their kind still lingered in the most remote corners of the Arctic, hidden in ice caves and forgotten valleys. Western explorers, skeptical of indigenous mythology, often dismiss these accounts as primitive superstition. Yet history is littered with strange encounters that defy easy explanation. In 1880, a British expedition led by Captain George Nares reported unusual findings during their survey of northern Ellesmere Island. In his private journals, only recently made public, Nares described enormous footprints discovered in snow-covered valleys far from any known human settlement. His men also reported hearing unearthly vocalizations echoing through the ice at night, sounds they could not attribute to any known animal. Similarly, in 1906, members of the Peary Arctic expedition recorded bizarre observations. Robert Peary himself noted in his log that several of his Inuit guides refused to enter certain regions, claiming the areas were cursed and inhabited by things that walk like men but are not men. Peary, ever the pragmatist, ignored these warnings, but strange incidents plagued the expedition. Equipment mysteriously damaged, supplies vanishing, and one team member reporting a close encounter with a massive, fur-covered figure that watched him from a distance before disappearing into a blizzard. What were these creatures? Were they remnants of a lost hominid species, perhaps a cold-adapted branch of Neanderthals or an entirely unknown lineage? Or were they something else entirely? Cryptids that had evolved in isolation, perfectly suited to the harshest environment on Earth? The scientific community, of course, scoffed at such notions. without physical evidence, bones, tissue samples, irrefutable photographic proof. The idea of an undiscovered large mammal in the Arctic was deemed ludicrous. Yet the reports persisted. Trappers, hunters, and explorers continued to return with stories that were remarkably consistent. Massive footprints, eerie howls, sightings of towering, ape-like figures moving through the snow with unnatural speed and grace. By the time Captain Voss launched his 1923 expedition, the legend of the Arctic Yeti, though not yet known by that name, was already whispered about in the halls of exploration societies and among seasoned Arctic travelers. Some called it the glacier ghost. Others referred to it simply as the White Devil. But regardless of name, the description was always the same: a creature of immense size and strength, covered in white or gray fur, bipedal and seemingly intelligent. A predator that understood the ice better than any human ever could. Voss, despite his public skepticism, had heard these stories. In fact, part of his motivation for the expedition was to investigate these claims, though he would never admit it openly. In a letter to a colleague written weeks before his departure, Voss confessed a fascination with the possibility of unknown fauna existing in regions yet unexplored by modern science. He believed, perhaps naively, that if such a creature existed, it could be documented, studied, and understood. He was wrong. The Arctic does not give up its secrets easily, and some secrets, once uncovered, carry a terrible price. As Voss and his men pushed deeper into the Greenland interior, they were entering a realm that had remained unchanged for millennia. This was a landscape sculpted by forces beyond human comprehension. Glaciers that moved like living things, ice formations that groaned and cracked with voices that sounded almost sentient, and a silence so profound it felt oppressive. The men felt it, that sensation of being watched, of trespassing in a place where they did not belong. Bjorn, the guide, grew increasingly uneasy. He had spent his life in the Arctic, but this region felt different. Wrong, he told the captain one evening. This place feels wrong. Superstition, Voss replied, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. But Bjorn shook his head. The ice remembers, he said cryptically, and something should not be disturbed. What did he mean? The old guide would not elaborate, but his words hung in the cold air like a curse. The men tried to ignore the growing dread, but it was impossible. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every distant sound felt like a warning. On the 25th day, they discovered the cave. It was Lars, the cartographer, who first spotted it, a massive opening in the side of the glacial wall, partially obscured by snow and ice. The entrance was large enough to drive a truck through, and from its depths emanated a faint, almost imperceptible current of warmer air. The men approached cautiously, their curiosity overriding their fear. Inside, the cave was vast, a cathedral of ice. Frozen stalactites hung from the ceiling like teeth, and the walls were smooth, almost polished, reflecting the dim light of their lanterns in eerie, distorted patterns. The floor was covered in a thick layer of frost, and scattered across it were bones. Hundreds of them, caribou, seals, possibly even polar bears, picked clean and arranged in strange, deliberate patterns. "Something lives here," Dr. Hartmann whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally. And then they saw the carvings. Crude, ancient symbols etched into the ice walls. Spirals, handprints, and figures that resemble humans but were elongated, monstrous. And among them, one image that made the men's blood run cold. A massive, upright creature with long arms and a featureless face, surrounded by smaller human figures fleeing in terror. "We need to leave," Bjorn said urgently. "Now." But it was too late. From deep within the cave came a sound, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the ice and into their very bones. And then, from the darkness, came the eyes, pale, reflective, inhuman, watching. Panic is a primal thing. It bypasses reason, logic, and training, reducing even the most disciplined men to their basest instincts. When those pale eyes appeared in the depths of the ice cave, glowing faintly in the lantern light, like twin moons suspended in the void, every man felt it, the overwhelming urge to run. And run they did. Captain Voss shouted orders that no one heard. Dr. Hartmann dropped his equipment. Thomas Mahler's camera shattered on the frozen ground as he stumbled backward. Lars tripped over a pile of bones, his scream echoing through the icy chamber. Only Bjorn maintained a sliver of composure, firing his rifle blindly into the darkness. The shot was deafening in confined space, reverberating off the walls in cacophony of sound. But there was no roar of pain, no cry of a wounded animal, only silence, and then movement. The creature or creatures did not charge. They did not attack with the wild ferocity of a cornered predator. Instead, they moved with deliberate, calculated purpose. Shadows detached from shadows, massive forms shifting in the dim light. The men could not see them clearly, only impressions. Hulking shoulders, arms that drag along ground, heads that turn with an unsettling, almost mechanical precision. Out! Get out! Voss finally found his voice, and the men scrambled toward the cave entrance. They spilled out into the blinding white expanse of the glacier, gasping for breath, hearts hammering in their chests. Behind them, the cave remained silent. Nothing emerged, but the feeling of being watched did not dissipate. If anything, it intensified. They ran. For hours, they ran across the ice, stumbling, falling, dragging each other up. Their supplies, their equipment, most of it was left behind in the cave. All they had were the clothes on their backs, a few rifles, and the crushing weight of terror. When they finally stopped, collapsing in exhaustion, night had fallen, and the howls began again. This time they were closer, so close that the men could feel the vibrations in the ice beneath them. The sounds came from all directions, a coordinated symphony of calls and responses. It was not random. It was communication. "They're surrounding us," Bjorn said, his voice hollow. "They're hurting us." Hurting us where? Dr. Hartmann demanded, though he already feared the answer. Bjorn pointed into the darkness, toward a jagged ridge of ice formations barely visible against the night sky. They're pushing us toward the crevasse field. A crevasse field, a deadly maze of hidden cracks and fissures in the ice, some shallow, others bottomless. To enter such a place in daylight was dangerous. At night, in the dark, it was suicide. And yet, behind them, the howls grew louder, more insistent. The creatures were closing in, giving the men only one option: move forward or be taken. Captain Voss made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We go through," he said. "Slowly, carefully. It's our only chance." They moved like ghosts through the frozen labyrinth, testing each step, roped together in a desperate bid to prevent anyone from falling into the unseen depths. The howls followed them, echoing off the ice walls, making it impossible to determine how close their pursuers were. At one point, Thomas swore he saw a figure standing on a ridge above them, a towering silhouette outlined against the starless sky, motionless, watching. "Don't look at it," Bjorn hissed. "Keep moving." Hours passed. The men lost all sense of time, all sense of direction. They were guided only by Bjorn's instincts and the vague hope that they might somehow, miraculously, escape. And then, just before dawn, the howls stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, a suffocating, oppressive quiet that pressed down on them like a physical weight. "Are they gone?" Lars whispered. No one answered. And then, without warning, the ice beneath them groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Cracks spider-webbed across the surface, spreading rapidly. The men froze, barely daring to breathe. "Move," Bjorn said quietly, slowly. But it was too late. With a sound like thunder, a section of the ice gave way. Dr. Hartmann, standing at the edge, dropped into the darkness with a scream that was cut short by a sickening crunch. The remaining men scrambled backward, but the collapse was spreading. Lars fell next, his hand slipping from the rope. Thomas managed to grab hold of an ice shelf, dangling over the abyss, his face white with terror. Captain Voss and Bjorn pulled him up, and the three men crawled away from the collapsing ice, gasping, shaking. When they finally reached stable ground, they looked back. Two of their companions were gone, swallowed by the frozen depths. And in the growing light of dawn, they saw them, the creatures. Three of them, standing at the edge of the crevasse field, watching. They were massive, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, covered in matted, grayish-white fur. Their faces were obscured by the distance and the dim light, but their posture was unmistakable, upright, humanoid, but utterly alien. For a long moment, men and creatures regarded each other, and then, without a sound, the creatures turned and walked away, disappearing into the ice fields as if they had never existed. The three survivors did not speak. They did not need to. They understood, in that moment, a terrible truth. They had been allowed to leave. This had not been an escape. It had been a dismissal. The journey back to civilization was a nightmare of cold, starvation, and delirium. Captain Voss, Bjorn, and Thomas Mahler traveled for 19 days with almost no food, melting ice for water, and pushing their bodies far beyond the limits of human endurance. Frostbite claimed 2 of Bjorn's fingers and 3 of Thomas's toes. Voss developed a hacking cough that would plague him for the rest of his life. But they survived. Barely. When they finally staggered into the coastal settlement, more dead than alive, the locals were shocked. The expedition had been presumed lost. No one expected survivors. And when the 3 men began to recount their story, the reactions ranged from skepticism to outright disbelief. "You were chased by what?" a Danish colonial administrator asked, barely concealing his amusement. "Ice Yetis," Thomas said flatly, his eyes hollow. "That's what we're calling them, because I don't have another name for what we saw." The administrator exchanged glances with his colleagues. "Gentlemen, you've been through a terrible ordeal. Exposure, starvation, psychological trauma. It's understandable that." "We know what we saw," Captain Voss interrupted, his voice cold. "And we have proof." The proof, such as it was, consisted of Thomas's photographs. Most of his equipment had been lost in the cave, but he had managed to salvage a single roll of film that he had been carrying in his coat pocket. When developed, the images were grainy, blurred, and difficult to interpret, but there in several frames were undeniable shapes, large, upright figures moving through the snow. One photograph, taken from a distance, clearly showed a massive handprint pressed into the ice, with a human hand placed beside it for scale. The difference was staggering. The photographs were submitted to various scientific institutions. The responses were uniformly dismissive. "Hoaxes," declared one prominent zoologist. "Shadows and pareidolia," insisted another. The men were suffering from hallucinations induced by hypothermia and oxygen deprivation. But not everyone was convinced of the dismissals. A few researchers, particularly those familiar with cryptozoology and indigenous folklore, found the account compelling. Dr. Ivan Sanderson, a biologist and early cryptozoology pioneer, corresponded with Captain Voss and later wrote that the 1923 expedition represented one of the most credible accounts of an unknown bipedal creature in the polar regions. More intriguing were the corroborating reports that emerged in the years following the expedition. In 1927, a Russian geological survey team working in the Siberian Arctic reported a similar encounter. They described being stalked by white-furred giants that observed their camp from a distance but never approached directly. Several members of that team also reported finding massive tracks in the snow and hearing vocalizations that matched those described by Voss and his men. In 1931, a Norwegian trapping company operating near Svalbard documented a series of strange incidents. Equipment was found destroyed, supplies vanished, and one trapper claimed to have been chased by a creature that walked like a man but moved faster than any human could in deep snow. The trapper was later found dead, frozen in a crevasse, but his colleagues insisted his death was not accidental. They believed he had been driven there. Perhaps most compelling was the testimony of an Inuit elder named Attica, interviewed by an anthropologist in 1935. When asked about the Voss expedition, Attica nodded knowingly. "The tunnet," he said, using an old term for the tornit. "They are still here, in the deep ice. They do not like when outsiders come. They protect their territory." "Have you seen them?" the anthropologist asked. "Once," Attica replied. "When I was young, my father and I were hunting. We saw 3 of them, watching us from a ridge. My father said we must leave immediately. He said they were deciding whether to let us live. We left. We did not hunt in that area again." The anthropologist pressed for more details, but Attica would say no more. "Some things," he said quietly, "are better left alone. The scientific establishment, however, remained unconvinced. Without a body, without irrefutable physical evidence, the Ice Yeti was relegated to the realm of legend and speculation. Captain Voss became a pariah in exploration circles, mocked for his wild tales. Thomas Mahler withdrew from public life, haunted by what he had seen. Only Bjorn seemed unaffected, returning to his work as a guide. When asked about the expedition, he would simply shrug and say, "I know what I saw. I don't need anyone to believe me." But the story did not die. It persisted, passed along in whispers among explorers, researchers, and those who ventured into the far north. And over the decades, the evidence, fragmentary, circumstantial, but persistent, continued to accumulate. Footprints, vocalizations, blurry photographs, eyewitness accounts, none of it definitive, all of it unsettling. And then, in 1952, something extraordinary happened. A team of American researchers conducting ice core sampling in northern Greenland discovered something buried deep within a glacier, a partial skeleton. The bones were large, far larger than any known human, and the skull structure was unlike any recognized hominid species. The findings were classified, ostensibly for further study, and then quietly suppressed. Official reports stated the remains were likely those of a deformed polar bear, but leaked documents suggested otherwise. One researcher, writing in a private letter, described the bones as disturbingly humanoid and noted that, if these are genuine, they represent an unknown species of cold-adapted primate. The bones disappeared into a storage facility and were never publicly examined again. But their existence, however briefly acknowledged, lent credence to the idea that something unknown might indeed inhabit the Arctic wastes, something that has learned to avoid humanity, to remain hidden, to survive in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, something that, on rare occasions, reveals itself, not out of curiosity, but as a warning. Stay away. For every believer, there are a dozen skeptics. And in the case of the Ice Yeti, the skeptics have always held the upper hand. The scientific method demands evidence, repeatable, verifiable, physical evidence. Anecdotes, no matter how compelling, do not suffice. Grainy photographs, no matter how suggestive, do not constitute proof. And so, the official stance of the scientific community has always been clear. The Ice Yeti does not exist. But what, then, do we make of the accounts? How do we explain the consistency of the reports, the similarity of the descriptions, the genuine terror of the witnesses? Skeptics have offered several theories. Each attempt can provide a rational explanation for the seemingly irrational. The Arctic is a brutal environment. Extreme cold isolation, oxygen deprivation, and the relentless monotony of the ice can wreak havoc on the human mind. Psychologists have long documented the phenomenon of polar madness, a state of psychological deterioration brought on by prolonged exposure to harsh conditions. Hallucinations, paranoia, and delusions are common symptoms. Could the men of the Voss expedition have succumbed to this condition? Could their Ice Yeti have been nothing more than a collective hallucination, a shared delusion born of stress and fear? It's possible, but it doesn't fully explain the physical evidence, the footprints, the photographs, the destroyed equipment. Hallucinations do not leave tracks in the snow. They do not break sleds or scatter supplies. Unless, of course, the men themselves cause the damage in a delirium, unaware of their own actions. But this theory requires us to believe that multiple trained, experienced explorers all experience the same hallucination at the same time, which strains credibility. Another common skeptical argument is that the witnesses simply misidentified known Arctic fauna. Polar bears, for instance, are massive, powerful, and can stand upright. In poor visibility, during a blizzard, could a rearing polar bear be mistaken for a bipedal creature? Perhaps. But polar bears are well documented. Explorers of that era were intimately familiar with them. Captain Voss himself had encountered dozens of polar bears during his career. It seems unlikely that he would mistake one for an entirely different type of creature. What about other possibilities? Musk oxen? Walruses? None of these animals fit the description given by the witnesses. They do not walk upright. They do not produce the vocalizations described, and their tracks are easily distinguishable from the massive, humanoid prints found by the expedition. Perhaps the most damning accusation leveled at Captain Voss and his men is that they fabricated the entire story. Why? Fame, notoriety, financial gain from book deals and lecture tours. This theory suggests that the expedition was a failure. Perhaps they became lost. Perhaps they encountered natural disasters. Perhaps two men genuinely died in accidents. And to save face, Voss concocted a sensational tale that would divert attention from his failures. But this theory, too, has significant weaknesses. Thomas Mahler, the photographer, never profited from the story. He withdrew from public life and refused interviews for the rest of his life. Bjorn, the guide, similarly avoided publicity. If this were a hoax, it was a poorly executed one, yielding little benefit to its supposed perpetrators. Moreover, the psychological toll on survivors was evident. These were not men reveling in fame. They were men haunted by trauma. A more modern, conspiracy-oriented theory suggests that the Ice Yeti encounters were actually sightings of secret military experiments, perhaps cold-weather survival suits, remote-operated vehicles, or even early attempts at genetic manipulation. This theory posits that governments, testing new technologies or conducting classified research in remote Arctic regions, inadvertently created the legend of the Ice Yeti. It's an intriguing idea, but there's no evidence to support it. No declassified documents, no whistleblowers, no paper trail suggesting such experiments were conducted in 1923 or the surrounding years. While governments have certainly conducted secret tests in remote locations, the technology required to create convincing Yeti sightings in the 1920s simply did not exist. The most scientifically plausible, yet still controversial theory is that the Ice Yeti represents a surviving population of archaic hominids. We know that Neanderthals and Denisovans coexisted with Homo sapiens for thousands of years. We know that Homo floresiensis, the hobbit species, survived in isolation on an Indonesian island until relatively recent times. Is it possible that another branch of the human family tree adapted to Arctic conditions and survived into the modern era? Cold adaptation is not unprecedented in hominid evolution. Neanderthals, for instance, had robust, stocky builds well suited to cold climates. Could a similar species have evolved even greater cold tolerance, developing thick fur, increased body mass, and behavior? Population existed, and if it were small and highly mobile, it could conceivably have avoided detection by modern science. But again, we return to the fundamental problem. Where are the bodies? Where are the bones? Where is the incontrovertible proof? Without it, this theory remains speculation, however scientifically grounded. The skeptics, in the end, are not necessarily wrong to demand evidence. Science requires rigor, but their dismissals often carry an air of arrogance, a refusal to entertain even the possibility of the unknown. And in doing so, they miss something important: the pattern. The reports are too consistent, too geographically dispersed, too persistent across decades and cultures to be entirely dismissed. From the Inuit of Greenland to the explorers of Norway, from the trappers of Siberia to the researchers of Canada, the accounts share a common thread. Something is out there, something that watches, that moves through the ice, that understands its environment with an intelligence that rivals or surpasses our own. Belief requires proof, but proof requires looking. And perhaps, just perhaps, humanity has not looked hard enough. For decades, the story of the 1923 Voss expedition remained a curiosity, a footnote in the annals of Arctic exploration. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, advances in technology and a renewed interest in cryptozoology brought the Ice Yeti back into the spotlight. And with this renewed attention came new evidence, fragmentary, tantalizing, and deeply unsettling. In 1998, a team of wildlife biologists conducting a long-term study of polar bear populations in the Canadian Arctic stumbled upon something they could not explain. While reviewing footage from remote, motion-activated cameras set up to monitor bear activity, they noticed an anomaly. In one clip, lasting only a few seconds, a large, upright figure crossed a frame. It moved with smooth, loping gait, far faster than any human could manage in deep snow. The figure was covered in light-colored fur and appeared to be over 7 feet tall. The footage was grainy and inconclusive, but it did not match any known animal in the region. The researchers debated whether to release the footage publicly. Eventually, they decided against it, fearing ridicule and damage to their professional reputations. But the clip leaked online in 2003, sparking a new wave of interest in Arctic cryptids. Skeptics, predictably, dismissed it as a hoax or a misidentified bear. Believers saw it as vindication. Then, in 2007, something even more remarkable occurred. A group of mountaineers attempting a remote ascent in the Brooks Range of Alaska reported a close encounter with what they described as a massive, white-furred humanoid. The creature had approached their camp in the early morning hours, apparently drawn by the smell of food. When the climbers emerged from their tents, the creature retreated but did not flee. Instead, it stood at a distance, observing them. One of the climbers, an experienced outdoorsman named Derek Halloran, later described the encounter in vivid detail. "It wasn't a bear," Halloran insisted in interviews. "I've seen plenty of bears. This was different. It stood upright the entire time, never dropped to all fours. Its proportions were wrong for a bear, too tall, too narrow in the torso. And its face, I couldn't see it clearly, but I got the impression of intelligence, like it was studying us, not just reacting on instinct." Halloran and his team took several photographs, but the creature was too far away for clear detail. Still, the images showed a large, upright figure that did not match the profile of any known animal. Wildlife experts who reviewed the photos were divided. Some insisted it was a bear. Others admitted they couldn't be certain. But perhaps the most compelling recent evidence came not from a photograph or a video, but from DNA analysis. In 2014, a geneticist named Dr. Sarah Kellerman, working at a university in Anchorage, received a peculiar sample from a colleague, a tuft of coarse, white hair collected from a remote area of northern Alaska. The colleague, a geologist, claimed to have found it snagged on a rock outcropping near an ice cave. Curious, Kellerman ran a DNA analysis. The results were baffling. The sample did not match any animal in the genetic database. It was primate DNA, but it was not human, not chimpanzee, not gorilla. The genetic markers suggested something ancient, a lineage that diverged from known primates hundreds of thousands of years ago. Kellerman ran the test multiple times, suspecting contamination or error. The results were consistent. "I don't know what this is," Kellerman admitted in a private correspondence. "It's not from any animal I recognize. It's something else." She attempted to publish her findings, but no major journal would accept the paper. The implications were too controversial, the sample size too small. But Kellerman's data, leaked online, added fuel to the fire of speculation. Could this be genetic proof of an unknown hominid? Or was it a fluke, a contaminated sample, a misinterpretation of data? The debate raged on. But for those who had seen the creature, who had felt its gaze, who had heard its howls echoing across the ice, there was no debate. They knew the truth. In 2019, a documentary crew attempted to retrace the route of the Voss expedition. Equipped with modern technology, drones, thermal imaging, satellite communication, they hoped to find definitive evidence. They spent 3 months in the Greenland interior, following old maps and journals. They found remnants of the original camp, rusted equipment half buried in ice. They even located the cave, or what they believed was a cave, where Voss and his men had their terrifying encounter. The cave had partially collapsed, but the entrance was still accessible. The crew ventured inside, cameras rolling. They found bones, caribou, seal, and something else, something that the crew zoologist could not immediately identify. They found the carvings, still visible after nearly a century, etched into the ice walls. And they found tracks, fresh tracks, massive, humanoid tracks leading deeper into the cave system, into passages too narrow and unstable for the crew to follow. They set up cameras and waited. For 3 days, nothing happened. On the 4th night, the howls began. The crew captured audio recordings, deep, resonant vocalizations that echoed through the ice. Experts later analyzed the recordings and confirmed they did not match any known Arctic animal. The vocalizations had structure, pattern, almost like a language. And then, on the final night, The thermal cameras picked up something, a heat signature, large and bipedal, moving just outside the range of their lights. It circled the camp twice and then vanished into the darkness. The crew, unnerved, decided to leave the following morning. They had not obtained definitive proof, but they had obtained enough to suggest that the legend was more than mere myth. The documentary aired to mixed reviews. Skeptics dismissed it as sensationalized entertainment. Believers saw it as confirmation. The truth, as always, remained elusive, but the pattern continued: sightings, tracks, vocalizations, DNA samples. Each piece of evidence, taken alone, could be explained away, but together they formed a picture that was difficult to ignore. Something lives in the Arctic, something that we have not yet classified, not yet understood, and perhaps something that does not wish to be found. Assuming for a moment that the Ice Yeti is real, that it exists as a tangible biological entity rather than a myth or hallucination, what are we to make of it? What does its existence imply about our understanding of the natural world, about evolution, about humanity's place in the web of life? First, we must consider the implications for primatology and anthropology. The discovery of a surviving archaic hominid in the modern era will be one of the most significant scientific findings in history. It would force us to reconsider the timeline of human evolution, to acknowledge that our family tree may have more branches than we currently recognize. The Ice Yeti, if real, could represent a lineage that split from the common ancestor of Homo sapiens hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of years ago. It would be a living fossil, a window into our deep past. But such a discovery would also raise profound ethical questions. If the Ice Yeti is indeed a sentient being, does it have rights? Should it be protected under international law? Or would it be treated as a scientific curiosity, subject to capture, study, and exploitation? History offers grim lessons in how humanity has treated lesser species, and even lesser humans. The prospect of encountering a creature that blurs a line between human and animal is fraught with moral complexity. Second, we must consider the ecological implications. The Arctic is one of the most fragile ecosystems on Earth, already under immense pressure from climate change. If an unknown apex predator exists in this environment, its discovery could have far-reaching consequences for conservation efforts. How large is the population? What is its range? What does it eat? How does it interact with other species? These questions would need to be answered before any conservation strategy could be implemented. But there is a darker possibility. What if the Ice Yeti is not merely a passive inhabitant of the Arctic, but an active defender of it? The pattern of encounters suggests intelligence, strategy, and a willingness to intimidate or eliminate intruders. Could the creature be deliberately discouraging human encroachment, protecting its territory from exploitation? If so, it would represent a form of resistance, a natural pushback against humanity's endless expansion. Third, we must confront the psychological and cultural impact. The existence of the Ice Yeti would shatter the comforting illusion that we have fully cataloged and understood the natural world. It would remind us that mystery still exists, that there are corners of the earth that remain beyond our control. For some, this would be thrilling. For others, deeply unsettling. Indigenous cultures, of course, have never doubted the existence of such beings. For them, the Ice Yeti or the Tornit or the Calypilic or whatever name they use is not a cryptid to be proven or disproven. It is simply a part of the world, a neighbor to be respected and avoided. Western science, with its demand for evidence and its skepticism of oral tradition, has dismissed these beliefs for centuries. The vindication of indigenous knowledge, should the Ice Yeti be proven real, would be a humbling moment for the scientific community. But perhaps the most important implication is philosophical. The Ice Yeti, whether real or imagined, represents the unknown. It is a symbol of everything that lies beyond reach of human knowledge, a reminder that the universe is vast, complex, and fundamentally mysterious. In an age where we believe we can Google any answer, map any terrain, and solve any problem, the idea of an undiscovered creature lurking in the ice is both terrifying and exhilarating. It challenges our assumptions, forces us to question our certainty, and invites us to wonder. And wonder, perhaps, is what we need most. Wonder keeps us humble. It keeps us curious. It reminds us that we are not the center of the universe, not the apex of creation, but merely one species among many, stumbling through a world we only partially understand. Captain Henrik Voss, in his later years, wrote extensively about his experience. In a letter to a friend, composed just months before his death in 1947, he reflected on an encounter that had defined his life. "People ask me if I believe in the Ice Yeti," he wrote, "as if belief were the point. I know what I saw. I know what hunted us through that frozen hell. I know that we were allowed to survive, not because we were strong or clever, but because something out there decided we were not worth killing. That knowledge changes you. It makes you realize how small you are, how fragile. We think we are conquerors of nature, but we are not. We are guests, and some hosts do not appreciate our presence." Voss never returned to the Arctic. He spent his remaining years writing, lecturing, and corresponding with researchers who took his story seriously. He died quietly in his sleep in a small cabin in the Norwegian countryside. His final words, according to the nurse who attended him, were, "It's still out there, watching." Bjorn, the guide, outlived Voss by several years. He continued to work in the Arctic, guiding expeditions and trapping for a living. When asked about the Ice Yeti, he would smile a sad, knowing smile and say, "The ice keeps its secrets, and that's how it should be." Thomas Mahler, the photographer, never spoke publicly about the expedition again. He destroyed most of his photographs, keeping only a few that he locked away in a safe. When he died in 1952, his family found the images, along with a handwritten note. "Do not seek what should not be found." The legacy of the 1923 expedition is complex. It is a story of survival, of terror, of the clash between human ambition and the untamed wild. It is a reminder that, despite all our technology and all our knowledge, there are still places on Earth where we are not welcome, still creatures that do not fear us, still mysteries that defy explanation. And as the Arctic ice melts, as climate change reshapes the polar regions, one cannot help but wonder, what else will be revealed? What other secrets lie frozen in the depths, waiting to be uncovered? And when they are, will we be ready? The story of the Ice Yeti does not end with the death of Captain Voss or the silence of his companions. It continues, passed down through generations, whispered in the dark corners of exploration societies, debated in the halls of universities, and shared around campfires by those who venture into the far north. The legend has taken on a life of its own, evolving and adapting with each retelling, yet always retaining its core, the image of a massive, white-furred creature standing at the edge of the ice, watching. In recent years, the story has gained renewed attention, driven in part by the rapid changes occurring in the Arctic. Climate change is transforming the region at an unprecedented rate. Glaciers are retreating. Sea ice is vanishing, and ecosystems that have remained stable for millennia are collapsing. As the ice melts, it reveals what has been hidden for centuries. Ancient campsites, lost ships, and, occasionally, things that defy easy categorization. In 2016, a team of archaeologists working in northern Siberia discovered a series of bones protruding from a melting permafrost bank. Initial analysis suggested they were human remains, possibly from a burial site dating back several thousand years. But closer examination revealed anomalies. The bones were significantly larger than those of any known human population, and the cranial structure was unusual, thick, robust, with pronounced brow, ridges and a jaw that suggested immense bite strength. The bones were sent to multiple laboratories for analysis, but the results were inconclusive. Some researchers suggested they were the remains of a particularly large Neanderthal or Denisovan individual. Others pointed to deformities caused by disease. A few, speaking off the record, admitted they had no idea what they were looking at. The bones disappeared into a Russian museum storage facility and have not been publicly examined since. But photographs and preliminary reports circulated online, fueling speculation. Could these be the remains of an ice yeti? Or are they simply another mystery, another puzzle piece that does not quite fit? Similar discoveries have been reported elsewhere. In 2018, hikers in northern Norway found a skull embedded in a glacier. The skull was large, vaguely humanoid, but with features that did not match any known species. Photographs were taken, but before formal excavation could be organized, an avalanche buried the site. The skull, if it ever existed, is gone. And then there are the sightings. Despite, or perhaps because of, increased human activity in the Arctic, reports of encounters continue. In 2020, a group of climate researchers stationed at a remote monitoring station in Greenland reported seeing a large, upright figure moving across the ice field near their camp. The figure was captured briefly on a drone camera before it disappeared into a snowstorm. The footage, later released to the public, was analyzed by experts. The consensus, inconclusive. It could be a bear. It could be a person in unusual clothing. Or it could be something else. A year later, in 2021, a commercial fishing vessel operating near the ice edge north of Iceland reported a bizarre encounter. The crew claimed that, during a night watch, they observed several large, pale figures standing on an ice floe. The figures appeared to be watching the ship. When the crew shone searchlights on them, the figures moved with startling speed, dropping off the floe and vanishing into the water. The captain filed a report with maritime authorities, noting the incident as unidentified biological entities. The report was archived without further investigation. These modern accounts, like those from decades and centuries past, follow a familiar pattern: brief sightings, inconclusive evidence, and profound sense of unease. The witnesses are not attention seekers or crackpots. They are researchers, sailors, guides, people with no reason to fabricate stories and every reason to avoid ridicule. Yet they speak, compelled by the need to share what they have seen, even if the world does not believe them. So, what are we to make of all this? How do we reconcile the persistent reports, the fragmentary evidence, and the steadfast denial of mainstream science? Perhaps the answer lies not in proving or disproving the Ice Yeti's existence, but in understanding what it represents. The Ice Yeti is a threshold creature, existing at the boundary between the known and the unknown, the real and the mythical. It occupies a space in human consciousness that is both ancient and modern, a space reserved for things that frighten us, fascinate us, and remind us of our limitations. Whether the Ice Yeti is a biological entity or a cultural construct is, in some ways, irrelevant. Its power lies not in its physical form, but in its symbolism. It is the shadow in the blizzard, the footprint in the snow, the howl in the dark. It is a reminder that, despite all our progress, we have not conquered the earth. There are still places where we are vulnerable, still environments where we are not the apex predator, still mysteries that elude our understanding. And perhaps, in the end, that is a good thing. Perhaps we need the Ice Yeti. We need to know that there are corners of the world that remain wild, untamed, and beyond our control. We need to be reminded that the universe is vast and strange, and that our knowledge is limited. We need the mystery, the wonder, the fear, because without them, we lose something essential: our humility, our curiosity, our sense of awe. Captain Voss and his men encountered something in 1923. Exactly what, we may never know with certainty. But their story endures because it speaks to a truth that transcends evidence and proof. The world is bigger than we imagine, and there are things in it that we will never fully understand. The ice is melting. The Arctic is changing. And as it does, the secrets it holds are being revealed, one by one. Some will be explained. Others will remain mysteries. And somewhere in the deepest reaches of the frozen north, where the wind howls and the ice groans, something still watches, waiting, listening, and perhaps remembering. The explorers came, the explorers left, and the ice endures. The legend of the Ice Yeti is not about proof or skepticism, believers or deniers. It is about the eternal human need to explore, to question, and to confront the unknown. It is about the stories we tell to make sense of a world that is vast and terrifying and beautiful. And it is about the acknowledgement that, no matter how much we learn, there will always be more that we do not know. In the end, the Ice Yeti is not a question to be answered. It is a mystery to be respected. And in respecting it, we respect the wilderness, the past, and the unfathomable depths of the natural world. The Arctic keeps its secrets. And perhaps some secrets are meant to be kept